I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you episode number 66 in this podcast dedicated to the improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. This is the long-predicted follow-up episode to the water fast that I just completed, along with several other Smart Drug Smarts listeners. I've been back in the world of food for about 4 days now at the time of this recording, and just had a conversation with a leading expert on fasting, gerontology, caloric restriction, ketogenic diets, and how all of these things interplay with one another and can have direct effects on a person's and a mouse's immune system. He is Professor Walter Longo from the USC Davis School of Gerontology and the director of the USC Longevity Institute. We're going to talk with him, and then I'm also going to share some feedback from some of the other participants in the water fast that we just did, so you can hear kind of a bouquet of subjective experiences on this rather unique practice of extended not eating. If you hang around until the end of the episode, I'm going to tell you the most historically guaranteed way to take psychedelic drugs and see dinosaurs. I'm not kidding. I'm going to leave it at that. But a very, very weird, ruthless listener retention gimmick from my hometown. But before we get into any of that, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
So while I was loafing around and atrophying while not eating this past week, I was reading a little bit about physical exercise, kind of thinking about what I wanted to be doing with my body once my body had an incoming fuel supply once again. And I read about how physical exercise habits correlate with gray matter volume in the hippocampus of healthy adult humans, which is always kind of nice finding an article about kind of average adult brains and how they might be benefited, since so much of the research seems understandably dedicated towards maintaining brains that are getting very old or that are getting banged up by life's mishaps and misuses. But this was a paper from actually 2013 was when this was originally published. There had been at the time findings suggesting that physical activity was strongly correlated with gray matter volumes in the brains of both children and the elderly, but there hadn't been so much study on people in their second through fifth decades of life, and that's what this study was seeking to cure. And not surprisingly, based on the other studies, the trend continued, and what they found was, although the number of exercise sessions per week didn't seem to matter so much, the total number of minutes per week spent exercising showed a significant positive correlation with the volumes of both the right and the left hippocampus. They said in the study's analysis, the causal role of exercise in modifying hippocampal neuroplasticity has been well documented in the animal literature. Numerous studies have demonstrated that increased wheel running in mice leads to enhanced neurogenesis, cell survival, dendritic complexity, and long-term potentiation within the dentate gyrus. These neural changes are due in part to an increase in the production of brain-derived neurotropic factor. Moreover, exercise and the accompanying brain changes are also associated with enhanced cognition and memory performance in rodents. Together, these findings suggest a strong link between increased physical activity, hippocampal growth, and cognitive functioning in animal models. The human participants in this particular study were 61 healthy right-handed adult volunteers ranging in age from 18 to 45. So assuming that you, like me, are plagued by the thought of somebody coming up to you and saying, "My hippocampus is bigger than your hippocampus," get yourself to the gym or the running track or the treadmill or any of those things and up your minutes of exercise per week. Your hippocampus will thank you for it. And in the listener reviews department, I actually took a look inside the Australian iTunes store this week at the prompting of a listener who said that he left me a 5-star review, and of course I was overjoyed, did my obligatory backflip, and then went to iTunes, and I couldn't find the review, and I'm like, oh, well, maybe he didn't. And upon investigation, found out that he was Australian. And yeah, I guess Australians see completely different reviews than Americans like me. Anyway, I found the review, which in true Australian fashion was so enthusiastic in his emotions toward the podcast that he couldn't help but use profanity. But he said, "Blankety blank, I love this podcast. Brilliant. Have so wanted something like this since I heard about podcasts." So yeah, by the way, thank you to any and all of you out there in the regions of the internet that I might not actually be checking for listener feedback on these things because I'm hobbled by being an English speaker and a very, very bad German speaker. But I'm going to trawl around a bit more and find out what feedback I might be listening now that my eyes are opened to this. And of course, all of us good old-fashioned vanilla variety Americans who've left reviews for the podcast, that is very much appreciated also.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I think it was 10 episodes ago that we interviewed Dr. Thomas Seyfried and talked about ketosis and cancer. And that sort of led me down this rabbit hole of being interested in doing an extended water fast for the apparent anti-cancer benefits that could provide. Now, as far as I know, I don't have cancer. I've never had it, but there's evidence to suggest that an extended bout of ketosis, in this case, probably 4 days of deep ketosis from my perspective, since the first few days I was burning the sugars out of my system, could make my body such an unhospitable environment to any little stray cancer cells that might be floating around there, that it could essentially starve them out, say, hey, don't plant your flag here, cancer guys, no tumors, thank you very much, and then repeat that process about once a year. So that's what I was doing between the 16th and the 22nd of February this year, starting at midnight and ending very promptly at the following 7 days later midnight. I did not have a single thing to eat other than water. No tea, no coffee, no non-caloric sweeteners, no anything like that. No smart drugs, no vitamins of any sort. There's a lot of different ways that people approach fasting and a lot of sort of mixed terminology that gets thrown around when people are talking about fasting. And in fact, even in the coming interview with Professor Walter Longo, there's one or two times where I have to clarify which type of fasting we're talking about. Are we talking about calorie reduction or complete acaloric fasting? And it is a complex topic. There's probably not a better person to talk with than Dr. Longo about this particular subject, though. Dr. Longo is originally from Genoa, Italy, and is a faculty member at the USC Davis School of Gerontology, and as mentioned, is the director of the USC Longevity Institute. So as the weeks ticked by and I knew that my fast was coming up and I was going to be doing a lot of not eating and that this was going to require a great deal of willpower and not be a pleasant experience necessarily, I did a lot of reading up on it. And while the anti-cancer thing was sort of enough of a hook to get me interested originally, as I did more reading, I heard a lot about potential additional benefits that I hadn't even really known about going in. And one of the things that floated across my radar screen were some studies that implicated fasting, even less than the time that I was going to be doing it, as sufficient to sort of start a process that would reboot the immune system in a way, winnow out a lot of cells that might not be performing adequately within the immune system, and then see sort of a springboard effect when a person comes out of the fast and begins eating again. That idea that even a somewhat shorter fast could still have some pretty significant medical benefits was a nice bonus for myself and the other people that were participating in this water fast that we just did, because not everybody that started made it a week. It was pretty trying, especially for people in colder climates where just drinking nothing but mug after mug of hot water is still not terribly conducive to having a good week if it's snowing outside. So after this main interview, I'm going to share with you some of the feedback from the other participants in the water fast week that we just did. But right now, let's hear from Professor Walter Longo.
In mice, 2 to 3 days of fasting cause a lot of different effects. And one of the ones that we had published before was that it makes the mice very resistant to chemotherapy, and it makes the cancer cells very sensitive to chemotherapy. And in this study, we followed up to show that in addition to protecting the cells that are already there, what the fasting does is shrinks the immune system. So you have a lot of white blood cells that are actually killed by the fasting itself. So by the end of the fast, about 30% of the immune cells are destroyed. And then when you refeed the animals, the stem cells get turned on, the hematopoietic stem cells, so the blood stem cells get turned on. And then they have to rebuild what that 30% of cells that has been destroyed. And so now the overall effect is that you have new cells, and they're very functional cells, and they're cells that are really able to regenerate much of the immune system.
Of the 30% that die off, I guess it sort of stands to reason. One might assume that those are the weakest 30%, the 30% that are not able to handle the extra physiological stress. But is there anything to back up that idea?
Yes, there is that. When we look at the composition of the immune cells, there's something called myeloid lymphoid ratios, and that is affected by the aging process. And in this paper, we show that the fasting rejuvenates these ratios, suggesting that the immune system has now replaced less functional cells with more functional cells.
Are there any potential downsides to doing a spring cleaning of your immune system in this way? I'm thinking maybe lengthening telomeres, so the white blood cells that you have, they're new ones, but maybe there's a limited number of times you can do this reset over the course of your life?
Probably not. And keep in mind that you're not completely destroying. It's not like maybe if you undergo chemo or irradiation and you kill all the cells and then you have to rebuild everything, that would maybe a different story. But in this case, at least from our evidence, it looks like in every cycle you get rid of some of the cells and then you replace them with some new ones. Also, we've done longevity studies in mice. We take the mice at middle age, and then we do this once every 2 weeks until they die. And even though I cannot tell you what the results are, I can tell you that we certainly didn't see any problems, and suggesting that the mice run out of cells.
Obviously, there's a heck of a lot of differences between humans and mice, and not just limited to size and cuteness. 2.5 years is about normal lifespan for a lab mouse.
Right.
So if you're doing this intervention on a mouse every 2 weeks, and I know these things don't exactly scale, but based on what we know of mouse physiology versus human physiology, what would that scale up to looking like on a human?
Well, it's impossible to scale up in that way, but certainly we have just finished a clinical trial, human clinical trial, where we did our own version, maybe speculative, but we came up with once a month for 5 days. So, for example, the choice of the 5 days comes from our need to have certain changes in certain markers, including a marker called insulin-like growth factor 1. And that's one of the markers that we show in the paper that you referred to be very important for hematopoietic stem cell-based regeneration. So the 5 days, once a month, in our view, is the way to go for many, many different reasons. But we also are starting to collect evidence that maybe for a lot of people, even once every 3 months could be very beneficial, although probably not as beneficial as once a month. And also, it all depends for people where do you start. So in the clinical trial, we had people ranging from 20 years of age to 70 years of age. And we had people that had a very low BMI, let's say 18 or 19, and then we had people that are very high BMI. So if somebody was obese, doing it once a month is probably the way to go. If somebody has a BMI of 19, maybe you're looking at once every 6 months as the limit. There's all kinds of considerations when you move it to people. And the safety always has to be the number one, but also you have to look at what you're trying to achieve with the diet. We just got funding from the National Institute on Aging to do the human clinical trial for the immune system. And the way it's designed is that we're going to take elderly people, people that say between the age, I think it's 55 and 75. We just give them 2 cycles of 5 days of the diet. And this is not fasting, right? So this is a diet that has about somewhere between 600 and 800 calories a day. And so then we give them 2 cycles. Before the flu season, we give them 2 cycles of that diet, and that's it. Then we monitor the way they respond to the vaccine, and then we monitor how many of them are going to get the flu.
Tell us a little about the differences, what goes on within the body on a low-calorie diet, like something you just mentioned, the 600 to 800 calories, versus a strict acaloric fast.
Well, it depends. People just tend to think of food as food, or we think of food as a very complex cocktail of drugs, if you want to call it that. They're not drugs, but certainly that's how we view it. So you might think of 600 calories, but 600 calories can cause completely different effects based on what they contain. I'm talking about more than the most powerful cocktail of drugs that you've ever seen. We always find it interesting when people try to think of, it doesn't matter if it's less calories, it's less calories, it's going to have the same effect. We just published, for example, a paper that received a lot of media attention recently on proteins and showed that just a very small reduction in calories by taking away half of the proteins that people eat every day, which, you're looking at maybe on average 30 or 40 grams difference. Nothing else changed. And that we reported caused changes, and this is in the US population, changes in the risk for overall mortality of 75%, and changes in the risk of cancer mortality of 3 to 4-fold. So this number is still a relatively small population, about 6,000 people. So these are bound to maybe get a little bit smaller as we get larger population. But still, that just shows you that the idea of restriction is almost meaningless.
We had a group of us that were doing a water fast for a week. Some of us went strictly water. Others had things like tea, coffee, and still other people had things like activated charcoal with the idea that would absorb any toxins that got kicked out of the fat stores that that were being used and into the bloodstream. Can you tell us about some of those pros and cons of including things in an acaloric fast other than strictly water?
Yes, strictly water is really maybe for 1% of the population. And also it's dangerous because it can cause, let's say that you have hypotension or you have hypoglycemia, so low blood pressure or low glucose levels. That water-only fast can push you over the limit. When a journalist does it, I follow many journalists that have done this. And I guess it's okay. That's part of the, some journalists go to war. When you talk to the masses, that's very different, right? Because even if 2% of the people have severe side effects, you can imagine somebody driving and getting to a very low blood pressure and they can pass out in the car. We had people pass out in the shower. So water-only fasting is only something that you should only do in the clinic. Buchinger Clinic in Germany, the True North Clinic up in Northern California. There's some clinics that specialize in fasting. And most of them don't even do fasting anymore, right? Even though you're in the clinic. They don't even do water-only fasting anymore. What they do at the Buchinger, for example, is they have very low, let's say 100 calories from vegetables or something like that. And that's very common in a lot of clinics. And again, this is inpatients. There's a lot of crazy stuff that a lot of people do. Some of it makes sense, and eventually it's going to turn out to be very true, right? The charcoal you mentioned, who knows? I've never seen any real data on anything like that, right? So this is what we've been trying to do, turn a lot of these urban legends into actual data.
Is the 5 days you're talking about, is that acaloric, or is there still a small amount of calories involved?
No, there is calories involved. If you do the Buchinger method, you're looking at about 100 kilocalories a day, or maybe like broth and a vegetable soup. In the clinical trial, we have, for the past many years, worked very hard at understanding the components of the diet. So we're now able to make it between 750 and 1,200 calories and still get the same effects. So that's what our clinical trial was. We allow people to eat.
Yeah, having just done it, I would tend to agree. Eating 1,000 calories a day versus eating 0 is just not even comparable.
Well, no, it's completely different. So of course I've done it both ways. And I can tell you that once I started doing it with what we call fasting mimicking diets, it's just many fold easier. A lot of it is psychological, right? People are just used to have this routine of eating, and that's alone very important. And
so is this something that you're incorporating into your own lifestyle now?
Yeah, well, I have for many years, right? And also I don't eat lunch. So I only have breakfast and dinner. Yeah, so fasting to me is a daily intervention.
In the past couple of years, intermittent fasting, the idea of restricting your eating window to between 7 and 9 hours per day, has been gaining a lot of media attention and coverage. But you're doing breakfasts and dinners and just skipping lunch. Is that to say, is that just more convenient for your schedule, or are you not really a believer in the idea of time-restricted eating that intermittent fasting is about?
Well, intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating are two different things. Intermittent fasting usually refers to you eat one day, you don't eat the next day. Or what Michael Mosley and Michelle Harvey came up with is the 5-2 diet, in which 2 days a week you have less calories. And that's not really fasting, particularly because they're not consecutive days. So but those are usually referred to as intermittent fasting. The 5-2 has other problems. Imagine if you were to sleep very well 5 days a week, but then sleep only 2 hours on Friday and Saturday night. Now, a lot of college students do that. But I guess even college students know that's not a good idea. It doesn't work like that. Why? There are circadian clocks. If you normally eat lunch at 12, it's going to expect lunch at 12. And it's going to respond endocrinologically to have lunch at 12. And so now it's known if you affect that, change that, then you can have all kinds of problems, including insulin resistance and all kinds of other problems. And time restricted, I think it's got a lot of potential. And what I do is time restriction, right? So the breakfast and dinner is time restriction. So now you have all these hours between the breakfast and the dinner in which you don't eat, 12 hours of food. And also I think it helps you limit how much you can eat.
Have you found any differences in what you've read or studied between people that opt for lunch dinner versus breakfast dinner? I'm a lunch dinner guy myself. I'm just sort of wondering if there's pros or cons.
Lunch dinner means you have two major meals. That's okay if you're not gaining weight, but 70% of Americans are overweight or obese, right? So for most Americans, that's not going to work. So what you have to replace it with is a light breakfast and then one of the two meals. That seems to be working a lot better.
So let's talk a little about some of the cognitive changes when people do any sort of restriction on their normal dietary intake. What do you see in either complete or light fasts as far as cognitive and neurological changes?
I can tell you about the things that we published before, which is in mice, for example, we cycles of protein restrictions and normal proteins. So 1 week on, 1 week off. These were mice engineered to have Alzheimer's disease, human Alzheimer's disease proteins in their brain. And they did a lot better when they were on this alternating diet. Also, Mark Madsen has published on the alternate day fasting and Alzheimer's mouse models, and also shown that fasting makes it better for the mice that have these human proteins. I can tell you one thing that people don't know is that by day 3 or 4 of your fasting, your brain, for the first time in your life, switched to a ketone body-based metabolism. Your brain before that always used glucose and lactic acid for energy source. And now, starting on day 3 or 4, I started a switch to a completely new way of obtaining energy, which I had never seen before. And so they had to activate all kinds of new enzymes, et cetera, et cetera. This is why a lot of people get a headache the first time they do it.
Yeah, that was one thing that I found subjectively just amazing to think that I'm 38 years old, my body had never done this thing before. And the switchover process, it worked on the first try. It would be like trying to build a rocket to the moon and the first one takes off okay. It wasn't an easy process, but the fact that it worked at all was just kind of amazing to me.
Yes, and that tells you how fundamental fasting is in the functioning of every single organism ever created, right? Whether it's bacteria. We work on the starvation of bacteria, on the starvation of yeast and mice, et cetera, having to respond to periods of starvation has been there since billions of years ago in the very beginning. So you had food for a while and then you didn't. And that evolved is so deep into the human genome that, of course, it's going to work, even if you wait 70 years to do it the first time.
What do you see as some of the physiological upsides to occasionally dropping into ketosis for a person, whether for a short period of hours per day or people that do it nutritionally for weeks or months at a time?
Well, nobody knows. So is it the ketosis? Is it the fatty acids? Is it the ketone bodies? Or is it the lack of glucose? Or is it the lack of growth factors? Is it the high IGF-PP1, etc.? I mean, there's so many things that change during fasting that it's hard to know. Let's say you have a ketogenic diet. Just because the diet is ketogenic is not going to give you the same effects as the fasting. One thing I did point out when I talk about the paper, but it's really key to understand, is the concept of when you fast, you're shrinking everything and then rebuilding. That's really the key, I think, to a lot of the effects. So if you go into a ketosis and you're not shrinking anything, then you don't have any reason to rebuild anything. And right there, just eliminated one of the biggest effects of fasting. Also, if you go into ketosis, you don't necessarily have to get rid of intracellular toxins or extracellular toxins. That's another limitation that could be associated with ketosis or ketogenesis. Don't do this at home. I mean, unless you get somebody that is a pro that follows you, whether it's a doctor or a registered dietitian. If you want to do it at home, then do the 2 meals a day. That's by far the best and least risky, and the intervention that makes most sense for people that may want a lot of the same benefits. Probably not the same benefits, but certainly a lot of benefits without the risks.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Dr. Longo for taking the time to fill us in on the many, many interesting things to know about fasting, caloric restriction, ketogenic diets. There's way more information here that we could fit into any one episode, and you can expect some more specifically about ketosis and the cognitive effects on the brain in a future episode. That's something that I'm very much looking to do soon because I myself am actually transitioning for at least a month or two to a ketogenic diet to answer some of my own curiosity-based questions about just how it's going to feel to to run my brain off ketones rather than off glucose. But for right now, I'd like to do kind of a little wrap up on what it was actually like doing the fast. First of all, I should say I don't normally do much writing on the Smart Drug Smarts website, but I did do a fairly long blog post on the 6th day of the fast a few days ago, and we'll put a link to the notes. If you're curious about this, it's a pretty good subjective overview of what it was like doing it, and I wanted to write that while I was still in the midst of it to kind of see how my brain could hold up with trying to write something that was intelligible while in that depleted state. I actually think it held up pretty well, or at least as well as my writing normally does, which was kind of a pleasant surprise. But yeah, as far as overall thoughts, potential positive health consequences be damned, a water fast is not for the faint of heart. This was definitely kind of a taxing thing to undertake from a willpower perspective. I would kind of characterize it as not itching a scratch. Like if you had, poison oak or a bad rash and it itched and it didn't hurt, but it itched and you wanted to itch it, but you just couldn't let yourself because you knew, I don't know, maybe it was under a bandage or something like that. And that deep level of annoyance when your physiology wants you to do something and you've got to restrain yourself from doing it for a long time. And I think that this is probably the longest sort of deprivation of something quite as base physiology as eating that I've ever done personally. That being said, as far as something that really kind of wowed me, am I glad I did it? Absolutely. And one of the things that was most amazing about it was just kind of seeing what you're capable of, seeing that my brain really does work even if my body's not working that well, at least in this particular state. I felt myself getting physically weaker day by day, having less energy to move around, move upstairs, things like that. But cognitively, I'd say probably the worst days were days 2, 3, and 4, and actually was kind of on a cognitive upswing in the last several days once my brain had shifted over to burning fats rather than burning glucose. I'm going to read to you now just a couple of excerpts from some emails I got from other participants in Water Fast Week. This is from Shan Ness. She says, after 3 days, my body passed through the ketogenic flu state, and I felt so good about my mind, very clear, and I could feel my brain working so well. For this reason, I want to keep trying with a ketogenic diet after the fasting. I had a very hard time sleeping in the evening, starting on day 2 and going to the last day. This was my biggest problem during the fasting, actually much worse than the hunger, tiredness, or body pains. My mind was so clear and my body was so tired, the worst combination ever. But then at the end of her email, she says, I plan to do a 7 days water fast again in the summer because overall it made me feel really good. Wow. I read that email. I was surprised. I got a lot out of it, but I'm in no rush to do it again. I think I probably will do it again a year from now. But here's another email from a participant, Nicholas, who said, speaking about his day 4, I dreamt about accidentally breaking the fast by eating food. Minimal hunger today, very clear-headed. I got lightheaded once. I'm still fantasizing about eating food on Monday at 7 p.m. Chips, fish, something fried? Eating is such a socially pleasurable activity that it's crazy. It's funny, it's me too. I think it was also my 4th night not eating that I started having dreams, and pretty much had dreams every night from the 4th night on, where I would eat something in the dream and then realize, oh crap, I just broke the fast accidentally. On his last day, he wrote, sinuses have been exceptionally clear starting from day 2. The work retreat had too much complimentary good food and drink. It was nuts. Explaining the fast to people is getting old. My energy is good overall. I went on an hour jog today. No explosiveness, but the stamina is still there. I got a little nauseous before bed, but not sure why. I'm fantasizing about tomorrow. And finally, I got an audio voicemail from another participant, Robert, who did some smart drugs while on the fast, and I wanted to get his thoughts on that. I'm going to play that piece of audio for you.
The one thing I'll share is my experience with taking smart drugs during the fast. So I tried not taking any. I also took some Adderall, and I also took modafinil, and I found that relative to the days towards the end of the fast when it was the most difficult, when I took an Adderall or modafinil, the hard part of the fasting, namely the hunger and some physical discomfort that I would feel in the afternoons and evenings, was ameliorated somewhat by the smart drug, especially modafinil. It made it a lot more manageable. It was very hard for me to stay hydrated during the fast. I drink a lot of water, but I'd always have dry mouth, and I suspect I lost a lot of water weight. And of course, you're taking a drug or a supplement, you're having to process that through the liver, and of course, if you're dehydrated, that could be a problem. And of course, there might be some effects that I don't know of associated with taking these things without food. So, and also that whatever, say for example, anti-cancer benefits we were trying to get, I don't know if I just canceled them out with my smart drugs.
So that's that. A final hat tip to everybody that participated in Water Fast Week this year. It was excellent virtually starving alongside you guys. And for the time being, I'm absolutely planning on doing something similar again in 2016. So if any of you hear this at any time in the next year and are interested in getting in on the next go-around, just go ahead and drop us an email and we'll start a list of interested potential participants. Also, I've got stats on both my blood ketones, that's the breakdown elements that come from fat when your body starts burning fat instead of sugars, and also my body weight that I was tracking day by day during the course of the fast. Pretty interesting numbers. Lost weight, hand over fist. Almost 2.5 pounds a day for about the first 5 days. Then it started to level off a bit. Most of that's water weight. Most of that will come back pretty quickly over the next couple of days. But we'll have some data links up on the website for those of you that are particularly curious.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So the answer to the riddle that I posed at the beginning of the episode of the most historically guaranteed way to take psychedelic substances and then see dinosaurs is in fact to have been a dinosaur. Apparently, ergot, the fungus, the grass fungus that has been implicated in things ranging from mass hallucinations in the Middle Ages to the Salem witch trials to a disease in cattle called the Paspalum staggers, is apparently a very, very, very old fungus indeed, dating back to just about the same time that grasses themselves began, well into the era of the dinosaurs hundreds of millions of years ago. Scientists in my hometown of Corvallis, Oregon at Oregon State University, researching perfectly preserved amber fossils from Myanmar, apparently found loads of this ergot-like fungus on plants that there's every reason to think that dinosaurs would have been chowing down on. George Poinar Jr., an internationally recognized expert on life forms found in amber, said, "There's no doubt in my mind that it would have been eaten by sauropod dinosaurs, although we can't know exactly what effect it had on them." But ergot itself is some pretty interesting stuff. It's been used as a medicine to both induce abortion and to speed labor in pregnant women, and more than 1,000 compounds have been extracted or derived from it, including probably most famously the psychedelic lysergic acid diethylamide, better known as LSD. So although we don't know enough about dinosaurs' nervous systems to know how ergot or ergot poisoning might have affected them, for those of us that just like to sit around and speculate about dinosaurs like I know I sometimes do, it's even more interesting to speculate about a dinosaur tripping out on acid, now knowing that that's not an entirely fanciful notion.
Smart Drug Smarts. The podcast so smart, we have smart in our title. Twice.
I'd like to end this episode with a hat tip to the writer and neurologist Oliver Sacks, who's a best-selling author with a ton of books to his credit. I remember one of them, interestingly named The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, was one that my mom encouraged me to read, back when I was in high school, years and years and years ago. Oliver Sacks found out recently that he has terminal cancer and wrote a really moving article entitled My Own Life as an op-ed within the New York Times. We'll put a link to it in the show notes, and I think it's a really worthy read. I'm just going to quote the last sentence here, which I found really powerful. He writes, "Above all, I have been a sentient being, a thinking animal on this beautiful planet, and that in itself has been an enormous privilege and adventure." Powerful ideas and really worth taking the time to read.
Smart Drug Smarts.
And that is the entire episode number 66. If you enjoyed this episode, please recommend this podcast to your friends and or leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher. Visit us at smartdrugsmarts.com and drop a comment on the website. Any of those ways that you prefer to get in contact with us, everything is good, with the possible exception of showing up unannounced at our door on a Sunday morning and waking us up. That we do not approve of. The show notes for this and all episodes are online at smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that we talked about here. I'll be back at you next week with a still unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.